What? We're back already? Well then, welcome back. So in the last video, we learned how to select an element from the DOM. Remember, DOM manipulation is a two-step process. First step is selecting, and then the second step is manipulating. In the previous video, we saw the different select methods that we're going to be using from here to 4. We saw get element by ID, get elements by class name, get elements by tag name, and query selector, as well as query selector all. So now that means in this video, we're going to talk about the second step of this select and manipulate system, which is, let's say it together, manipulating. Now, do you remember the first part of this section, we actually saw an example of manipulating? So we selected the H1 tag, and then here we manipulated it. So right now, let's talk about things that we can change in the second step. What can be manipulated? I'll show you by showing you a couple of different ways to manipulate these elements. The first one, we can change an element style, and this is from our earlier example. So after selecting an element, we can just reach out to the style properties of this element. We can manipulate them. We can change its color or display. Okay, so the next thing that we can do is manipulate by adding or removing CSS classes with JavaScript. Now, this is more appropriate than the first method, and you're going to see the reason why in just a second. So the next thing that we can do is change the content of a tag. So wait, what? How do I change the text inside of a div tag, for instance? Yeah, I'll tell you that as well. I don't want to keep you in too much suspense. But I do want to show you also we can change attributes, the source on an image tag, for instance, or the href on an a tag. So why don't we get started with a style property and build from there. So when the DOM is constructed, an object is made for every single element, and these objects have properties called style. And the style property is a huge object with hundreds of properties, right? So these properties are for every CSS property that we could set. So we can write JavaScript that will then go to style and change the element. So let's do up an example. First of all, of course, we'll need to select the element that we'll want to change. Now let's say that I want to change this first div, which is background div 1, and I want to give a background to that div, all right? So to select that, I'll say var div to manipulate equal to document.querySelector, and then inside of it, dot background in quotes. And notice that I use dot here because class selector in CSS is dot, as hopefully you remember or know. We talked about this in the last video, so I'm going to assume you do remember. And again, this query selector is going to return only the first element that has this class. Right on, we talked about that too. So at the moment, we're going to store that div tag or the object that was made by this div tag in this div to manipulate variable. You follow? So we can make any changes with JavaScript now. So let's say that I want to change the style of this element, and I'll say div to manipulate dot style, and the style is a giant object, right? Tons and tons of properties. So I'm just going to try to change one of them. And I'll make another important point here is that I am writing JavaScript, not CSS. Yeah, sometimes you just have to remind yourself. So in this style object, there are all kinds of properties that we use in CSS, but there's a difference between naming these properties For instance, in CSS, we'll use font-size, but here instead of using dash, these JavaScript properties are with camel case. And I'll show you like this, font size, and we write all the properties written with dash in CSS in camel case. So I'll show you another example, and that's background color. We'll write it with dash in CSS, like background dash color. But here we're going to write it with the camel case, background color. Okay? So now let's say I want to give a height to this div. So I write div to manipulate dot style dot height equal to 50 pixels. All right, so let's add some width to this div. All right, div to manipulate dot style dot width equal to 400 pixels. And now we can give it some background color. So I'll write div to manipulate dot style dot background color equal to red. All right, so now I'm going to want to change the font size too, right? So I'll just write in here div to manipulate dot style dot font size equal to 30 pixels. Okay, so let's add a border. All right, div to manipulate dot style dot border equal to 5 pixels solid black. Now, let me point out something here. The right side must be a string. So even though in CSS we don't need to put quotes around red or around 400 pixels, for instance, remember, this isn't CSS. This is JavaScript. So we still have to follow the regular JavaScript rules. Okay, so let's save all this and go to the browser. So here I'll just refresh the page, and sure enough, we'll see that we've applied all that styling to this background div 1. All right, so now we can go back to our code. Now, what you're looking at here is we can actually select and manipulate an element's style properties with JavaScript, okay? Fabulous. But why are we doing all this? Of course, if we just wanted this to have styling like this from the time the page loaded, well, there's no reason to use JavaScript to do that, right? We just put it into our CSS file. But we would use JavaScript if we wanted it to turn red and have a black border when the user, let's say, has been on the page for 5 seconds, or if we wanted that to happen when the user scrolled to a specific part of the page, or when the user clicked on something, right? It's all about making things interactive, and we'll see how to do that shortly, but you got to have these fundamentals first. I'll tell you the nice thing about using the style property is that if you find yourself manipulating, let's say, a bunch of files on any individual element, like I'm doing here, and changing 5 different properties on this one tag, you might ask, is there a better way? And I would say, yes, there's a better way. And in fact, there's a few different reasons that there's a better way. And the first one, if you've been paying attention, is, it's not dry code. There's a lot of repeated div to manipulate dot style, div to manipulate dot style, div to manipulate dot style. Of course, we're not going to do that. I just made this to show you how we can manipulate just an element of a specific style property. Okay? So now I'm going to show you, well, first I'm going to comment out these lines. So I'll save this and go to console. And a refresh of the page, and sure enough, we've cleaned the browser, so we see our default HTML page. Now, let's talk about our second manipulation method, and that is adding and removing CSS classes. So what I mean by that, with JavaScript, we can select an element and then we can add or remove a CSS class to that element. So rather than just changing the properties inside the JavaScript, rather than doing styling with JavaScript, what we can do then is turn them on and off inside of the CSS file. All right. So I'll show you by example. Again, let's select the first div that has the background class. And then I'm going to add and remove a class to this element. And here I've prepared a class for this named add class. And of course, we can add this class directly to this element. But we're going to use JavaScript for that. And why is that? Because we're going to want to add this class, for instance, when we click this div. That's why. All right, let me just show you. So here we've kind of already learned how to do something like this. So I'll show you in JavaScript with one line, we can add a class that will then change 5 different properties. Okay, so let's go to our script.js file and see how to do that. I'll say div to manipulate.classList.add, and inside of that, I'll write the name of the class that I want to add. So in our case, add class. Okay, so I'll save this and go to the browser. So here I'll refresh the page, and yeah, here we are. We've applied this class to this div. Okay, so let's go back to the code. Now here also I can remove this class. I'll copy this line and paste it here. And all I have to do is change this add to remove. So now I remove the add class from this element. I'll save this and go to the browser. So here when I refresh the page, you'll see that we removed that class. Okay, back to the code. So there is another method in this class list, and that is toggle. Now, to show you that, I'm going to copy this and paste it here. And now I'll change this to toggle. So what this toggle does is it checks to see if this element has an add class. If there is, then it removes it. If there is not, then it adds that class. All right, so to see that, first I'm going to comment out these 2 lines, save this, and go to the browser. Now I can refresh the page, and it adds the class. So now I'll go back to the code again and call this toggle again. Save this, go back to the browser. So when I refresh, it now removes it. What do you say, huh? So in this video, we've talked about some of the manipulation methods. So what we'll do is we'll take a quick pause right here, and we'll continue in the next section.